This gentleman, Jack Buckley, is press secretary, and Paul Weston came from England. Luckily for us, they're doing a tour. They're at CPAC on a panel. His story is amazing. I worry that this could happen here unless we take our country back. I mean, we need to do that. So, Paul.
Thank you very much for a fantastic welcome. It's a pleasure and honour to be here. You know, we've been up against it in England for a long time now, and coming to America is like leaving a sinking ship with suffocating gases. You can't talk, you can't speak, you can't do anything. So coming here is just a wonderful experience, and thank you very much to Ken and Marie for organising this. I'm going to have to disappear behind
Irene Alter. It's Irene Alter that told us
and
about
Irene, thank you, Irene. After the CPAC thing, I spoke at the Centre for Security Policy with Frank Gaffney, and we were invited to a dinner party afterwards. And again, this is something that you simply couldn't find yourself doing in England. We went to this dinner party, and I've never met so many people in one room with so much intellect and so much knowledge and so much background of writing. People like Steve Coughlin and Diana West and Patrick Poole, and it was just unbelievable. And it reminded me of a friend of mine as a stand-up comedian back home. And he's little short, fat Welshman, quite hirsute. He married above himself. He married this very well-educated, Cambridge-educated private school girl. And he got into terrible trouble because he suddenly realised that he simply didn't know enough. And when he went to dinner parties, he said, I have to revise for dinner parties. So he goes to one of these things and he's sitting at a table, and someone says, I say, Rodri, what do you think vis-a-vis the situation in Utrecht at the moment? And he said, no, don't ask me about Utrecht, ask me about rivers. I revise rivers for tonight. And I'm standing in Diana West's kitchen, and this conversation is going on, and all I can think of is rivers. I revise rivers. This is all way over my head. I'm a big picture man, but the forensic detail is in that room was astonishing, and you could never have seen this probably in any other country than America. So congratulations for really giving us the strength in Europe to fight back, because you're very important over here in what we're doing. Now, when I came here a couple of years ago, I touched on something called the illusion of permanence that was in Samuel Huntington's book, The Clash of Civilizations. And it's this situation that tomorrow is going to be the same as today, and next week will be the same as this week, and next month will be the same as last month, and next year will be the same as last year. That's true, but the next 5 years are going to change enormously. The next 10 years are going to change enormously. And if we do decade per decade per decade up to the 2050s, Europe is going to either revolt and overthrow the Islamic jihad demographic time bomb, or we are going to succumb to it. And it's as simple as that. And I think of my grandfather, who was born in the late 1800s. Both my grandfathers, roughly the same time, both fought in the First World War. And they were born in a time that the motor car had barely been invented. Aeroplanes hadn't been invented. He lived through this time of enormous technological engineering changes. The changes that we're going to live through, if I have a grandchild, he or she is going to be fairly young by the end of the 21st century. Now, they will actually live in the 22nd century. I will have seen my grandfather, I will have seen my grandchild, I will have spanned 3 centuries. but my grandfather never expected what I am expecting to see. His technological changes whilst he was alive, we are going to see the biggest demographic changes in Western Europe, in America, in Canada, in the Anglophone world. And the demographic changes are going to be catastrophic for us as Europeans, as Christians, as capitalists. Catastrophic unless we can stop it. And Islam is not necessarily the biggest problem we face right now. Islam is a symptom of a disease, and the disease is called political correctness. Unless we can destroy political correctness, we cannot even start arguing our point about Islam. And political correctness, some people still think, there's a Daily Telegraph journalist called Tim Stanley, who's a doctor, he's an educated man, he should know better, but he doesn't seem to. He said that political correctness is one of these things that was designed to make people nicer to each other, politer to each other. He clearly has no idea of the background of it. And a friend of mine is working in the embassy in Germany. And after the New Year's Eve Cologne sexual assaults, harassments, rapes, he came back to England and he said, do you know, and this guy is working for the embassy, he's not just a grocer or something. He came back and he said, I shouldn't really say this, but what they are saying about the events in Cologne are true. But I can't really say this, and don't please tell anybody that I have told you that it's true. And this is political correctness muzzling the truth, muzzling reality, presenting this false reality of a situation that we all know is happening, but we have to be told by all of our elites that we are not allowed to see it, we're not allowed to comment on it, and so many people have fallen for it. I don't know how many people here follow Ezra Levant, but there's a fantastic video. He's just come back from Sweden, and he's in Malmö, which is now the rape capital of Europe. I think the rape capital of the world if you leave South Africa out of it. But in Malmö, talking to this middle-aged, educated, civilized-looking woman, and he was saying to her, do you think there's a problem here in Malmö with Somali Muslims? And she said, no, there's no problem at all. You know, we are a beautiful country. We welcome with open arms these people from other parts of the world who are suffering. And Ezra Levant said, supposing at one point the Somali Muslims outnumber the Swedes, do you think that will be a problem? And she said no. I think, she said, that they will slowly come round to our way of life. They've had 1400 years. It's not going to happen in the next 10. He asked her a few more questions. She's childless. And she said, listen, we need these people here because they are going to do all of the jobs that Swedes don't want to do. And when I, she said, am old, I will be looked after by Somali migrants. Well, you know, good luck with that. And I think to really understand this mindset, I mean, this is something that requires a vast amount of political indoctrination to get someone to voluntarily and willingly accept her grisly end, which I'm sure she will come to. But political correctness goes all the way back to the beginnings of, not even the beginnings of communism. I mean, the Communist Manifesto was written, I think, in 1848. And just before the final words, which were, you know, the working men of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains, there was a little interesting paragraph before that basically said that the Communist Party, everywhere in the world, will back any revolutionary movement that stands against the existing social and political order. Now that, to me, sounds very much like political correctness. It's exactly what it's designed to do. It is designed to tear down Western civilization, Christian, capitalist, Western civilization. World War I was when the Communist Party really thought they were going to come to power. They thought that when all of these enormous waves of aggression and enmity were unleashed, the working man would not go to war. They would not fight their fellow working men. But they did, and we had the First World War. Antonio Gramsci, an Italian communist, decided that the reason that the working men refused to follow communism and still followed the elitist rulers was because they were bound together by 2,000 years of Christianity, hundreds of years of capitalism, hundreds of years essentially of Western civilization. And he realized that the only way you could have a revolution in the West was to totally undermine every single foundation of the West. And then, so he called this cultural hegemony. And it meant taking over every single institution. The civil service, the police, the army, the media, most importantly the media, the educational system. Like the Jesuit priest, give me your child for 7 years, and I will give you the man. And if you look at American students coming out of your little mini gulags you have over here, you will see the Jesuit priest in operation, but this time not in anything beneficial, but in something destructive. Because political correctness only exists to destroy. And they divide everything into the victim and the oppressor and the oppressed. And in the 1917 Soviet Russian Revolution, the oppressor was the bourgeoisie, the oppressed were the proletariat. Now we all know what happened to the bourgeoisie. They were eliminated. In our world today, we are the bourgeoisie. If you're white, Christian, heterosexual, married, male, excusing the women in here, but those are essentially the people who built the foundations of Western civilization, and if political correctness is to work, those are the people that need to be eliminated from society. Everything they stand for, everything they have built, like your wonderful President Barack Obama, you didn't build that. Well, Mr. Obama, we did build that. You might hate it, but we built it. We built it because we are the product of thousands of years that made us into what we are today, which is Western civilization. And Western civilization is under attack. I read a very interesting thing the other day with someone actually talking specifically about political correctness, and they said that no country has yet been destroyed by political correctness, which is a little like looking at a bridge that is very slowly falling down because nobody is painting over the rust or repairing the rust. Just because no country has been destroyed yet does not mean it will not be destroyed. Many European countries stand today on the very edge of surviving or being destroyed. And it's an astonishing thing for me to come here and say this, as an Englishman, that the country that I was born into in 1963 is completely different now. My parents never envisaged that I would have to end up doing something like this, because none of this existed in 1963. But it's unless it stopped, it's going to happen. And it will happen between now and 2050. Political correctness started really in 1960. And it started on the university campuses here with people like Herbert Marcuse, who said, hey, hey, ho, ho, Western civilization has got to go. And the students lapped this up. And all of these students from the 1960s are now the establishment today. There are politicians, there are lawyers, they're working in our media, they're working running our police forces. They are absolutely everywhere. And if you think how long it took for the West to become what it is, and how long, or how short, 100 years is, compared to how long it took to get us here, this is like going up to a wonderful Dutch master painting, a Rembrandt. The work, the skill that went into doing this painting, and some leftist, PC, anarchist goes up to it and scrawls over it with an aerosol can. That's exactly the same, in a shorter time period, as political correctness is doing to us, in the way that it is destroying us. And in a way, they did have people like Marcuse and Lukács. Georgi Lukács said that the only way that we can bring about a revolution in the West is to destroy and overturn all the old values, otherwise we will never be able to achieve our aim. And despite the destructive note of that, he had a point. One of the things that he was talking about was the history of the nation-state is a history of war. That's true. So he wanted to abolish the nation-state. He said the history of man is a history of war. This is also true. But if you destroy the nation-states in order to bring about eternal peace, which is what the European Union is trying to do, and if you feminize men so they no longer feel the need to defend their nation-state against any external aggressor, that's sort of fine as long as the rest of the world is like that. But if you destroy your nation-state and you import Islam into that nation-state, and you feminize your men and say, do not fight them, and if you do, we will imprison you for being a racist or a xenophobe, then you are effectively handing your country over to the enemy, which is exactly what we're doing. We have a guy called Peter Sutherland, who is a chief UN migration officer. And he has talked about the importance of making all the European states multicultural. And the reason he's doing this is to break down the nation-state, it's to bring in divide and rule. And he has also said that it doesn't matter how many Muslims you take into Europe, they will benefit Europe. This guy is the UN Chief Migration Officer. Can you believe this? He is not acting in our interests. Importing Islam into Europe is basically signing our death knell. You have the same thing as we do, but you are many years behind us in terms of, maybe not in terms of radicalization, but in terms of numbers. You know, we are looking at enormous numbers here in Europe, 50, 60 million in Europe alone, and they are doubling every decade. There are only 500 million Europeans in Europe. And I'm going to come back to that later, but simply about demographics and birth rates and what have you. But the PC establishment controls the whole of Europe. Since Barack Obama's been in power here, it controls America. It certainly controls your universities. I can't believe that Stephen Harper in Canada has gone to be replaced by this Islamo-friendly Justin Trudeau. How does a country do that? How does it go from this man to that man? I don't understand it at all. But the higher up the chain you go, the higher up the political chain or the media chain or the educational chain you go, the more politically correct the people become. I have a friend in the army back home who's an officer who says that he is not allowed to talk about Islam. None of the officers in the British Army are allowed to talk about Islam. The rank and file soldiers are, but the officers are not. It is now apparently a court-martial offence to talk about Islam in the British military. And going slightly off track, but another friend of mine has a son in the Navy who is going out with a naval officer, a girl, and they came into London recently to an exhibition up at the Tower of London, where the old docks used to be. And for the first time ever, they were allowed off their ship in uniform. And normally, it is very dangerous to go anywhere in uniform in Britain these days, because you will be attacked by the Muslims. And I said, how did that work? How did you get off the ship and nothing happened? And she said, oh, it was fine, she said. We had about 100 armed policemen all around us. And she said this as though this was a perfectly normal thing to happen in England if you come ashore in your naval uniform. But as I say, the higher up the establishment you go, the more politically correct they become. And when we had the London tube bombings in 2005, after that terrible day, the Chief of Police, Sir Ian Blair, said, the words terrorism and Islam are two words that do not go together. The Chief of Police. His second-in-command, a guy called Brian Paddick, said exactly the same thing. Boris Johnson, our London mayor, didn't say it at the time, but he said it since. And when Fusilier Lee Rigby was run down by two Nigerian Muslims, run down, injured so badly he couldn't fight back, and then they proceeded to hack his head off in the street, whilst quoting the Quran at the same time. And after this terrible event, Prime Minister David Cameron came out and he said, Islam had nothing to do with the murder of Lee Rigby.
Sounds like Obama.
Sounds just like Obama. And recently, of course, we had, well, last year, I'm sure you've all heard of this, but for the last 20 years, we have had thousands and thousands of vulnerable girls in Britain who have been sex trafficked, taken all around the country, farmed out to friends of Muslims and friends of Muslims' friends, all under the nose of the local authorities, all under the nose of the media, and all under, most importantly, the nose of the British police. And they didn't dare say anything about this, because to do so would create tensions within the community.
Cowards.
And I'm thinking tensions in the community.
Cowards.
If I was the father or the brother of one of these poor girls, and this wasn't just in one area, this was across the entire country, Rotherham hit the headlines only because it was the first story to break. But imagine what was going through the minds, the torment for those fathers, for those brothers of these girls. How much community cohesion will be saved by not telling the truth 20 years ago and by allowing this to go on unhindered for 20 years in the full knowledge it was happening. And a guy called Andrew Norfolk, a British journalist, when he broke the story, he admitted that he had been sitting on this story for over a decade, and he did not want to release it because it would give ammunition to the right wing. Can you believe this? So, I heard someone sitting behind me just now talking about my arrest for quoting Winston Churchill. I wasn't actually going to talk about it, but I will say briefly why we did that and why it happened. And the idea that here is the greatest, I always say greatest living Englishman. Jack always tells me, you can't say that, he's dead. But when he was alive, the world's greatest living Englishman. And really, you can't say his book, The River Wars, which is where I read this excerpt from. You can't read an excerpt from a book that is on sale in every single high street bookshop. If it's a book of hate, take it off the shelves. You can't sell it and allow people and arrest people for quoting from it. But we knew it was going to happen. So we went to Winchester Town Hall, and George and Jack filmed the whole thing. And the idea is that even if nobody complained, George, part of Liberty GB, would then phone the British police and say there's some terrible, horrible, racist man on the steps of Winchester Town Hall saying nasty things about Muslims. But fortunately for us, some left-wing woman, as soon as I started talking, immediately telephoned the police, and the police got there very quickly. If you phone the British police now for the fact that your house is being broken into by an armed gang, you won't see them for half an hour. If you phone the British police and say there is a man saying something nasty about Muslims around the corner, they will send down a squad of cars, a helicopter, mounted police. I mean, they move quickly for Islamophobic offences in Britain today. And they asked me to move on, and I said, I'm not going anywhere. I said, if you do not move on, we will arrest you it's called a section 64 or some such thing, but it was not being arrested for inciting religious hatred. So I thought, well, surely you're going to arrest me for inciting religious hatred. And they said, no, we're not, we're arresting you for refusing to move on. Put me in a police car, took me to the police station, and stuck me in a cell for 4 hours to cool off. And then this policeman came back in and he said, okay, Mr. Weston, he said, we are dropping the charges for failure to move on when requested. And I thought, oh, really? I've come all the way to Winchester. I spent 4 hours in a cell, and I'm not even going to be arrested. And he said, but we are dropping those charges, but we are now re-arresting you for inciting religious hatred. Yes! Thank you, officer. The look on his face was a picture. And this offence of inciting religious hatred actually came from the days when the girls were being raped and abused in Rotherham and Oldham and Bradford and Burnley and Oxford and Dewsbury, all around the country. And I hold no warm regard for the British National Party and its then leader, Nick Griffin. But Nick Griffin talked openly about this, and he also talked about the chances at some point in the near future that Muslims would carry out a similar 9/11 style attack in Great Britain. And literally a few months later we had the 2005 train bombings. And they tried to prosecute him for saying this, for warning of this. They tried to prosecute him for inciting racial hatred. It went to court. Griffin pointed out that Islam is not a race. How can you possibly prosecute me for racial hatred? They said, yeah, you're quite right, and let him go. This is the extent that they think in the Crown Prosecution Service these days. They hadn't even thought this through. They are so keen to prosecute anybody that does this that they haven't even got the correct laws in place. So they immediately introduced in 2006 the inciting religious hatred, which essentially is come straight from the Organisation of Islamic Conference. It is Islam's blasphemy law. That has been introduced now by the British government. And you can guarantee that if you are very rude about Christianity or Jews, have you seen some of the left-wing events in London now, where people like Tony Blair's sister-in-law, Jack?
Yes.
Tony Blair's sister-in-law. I mean, the Jew hatred, the anti-Semitism coming out of these people is quite extraordinary. Not one has even been cautioned, let alone arrested. This law was brought in for one reason only. It was to clamp down on any valid, rational, realistic criticism of Islam. So, we find ourselves now in essentially a battle for survival, for Western civilization against Islamic barbarianism. And it is as serious and as simple as that. And I don't know whether we're going to win or not. Some days I think that if we have another tube bombing next year and another tube bombing the year after that, the English will finally wake up. We know that every year one of these bombings is stopped by the British police and by MI5 and MI6. But if they keep stopping them, and people are not shocked into the reality of this, it would be very easy for us to very quietly sleepwalk over the next couple of decades into a situation where we no longer have the numbers available for us that if it came to some sort of Yugoslavian-style civil war on the street, whether we could win it or not. And this is not just in England. In 1950, Europeans made up 50% of the global population. Today, I think we're down to about 25%. We are dwindling, we're not having children. The third world is expanding explosively in demographic terms. By 2050, according to the demographers, we are looking at producing only 5% of the world's babies. Now, this is not necessarily such a bad thing if we reduce our numbers, but you cannot reduce your numbers if you are introducing into your homelands people whose numbers are going to double and double and double every decade. And it didn't really matter in 1970 when we first had this problem in Great Britain, because we only had 100,000 Muslims, or maybe 1960, they came in a bit earlier. And when 100,000 become 200,000, England, although it's very, very small compared to America, England can still contain those figures, contain those numbers. Nobody is really affected by it. When the 200,000 becomes 400,000, it's much the same thing. But we now have something like 3 to 3.5 million.
Jesus.
They will become, over the next decade, 6 million. By 2036, 12 million. By 2046, 24 million. And their demographic, unlike ours, we are very top-heavy. Although we are a majority by 80%, I think, in England compared to the Muslim demographic, most of the English are aged over the age of 55 or 60. We are old and declining. Most of the Muslim demographic is under the age of 15. Now, that is the future in terms of foot soldiers, in terms of breeding units, to put it bluntly. And we have this situation in England now where polygamy is illegal. But a Muslim male can travel to Islamabad, marry 3 wives, and bring those 3 wives back to England, and then have 4 children with each wife. And the government, although it doesn't recognise officially polygamy, the government will pay housing benefit and welfare to all of those 16 plus the 4 wives, 20 plus. And of course you need more than one house for this, so you have these families now living in multiple houses. And meanwhile the English poor, who cannot afford to live anywhere, are straight to the back of the queue, because the housing queue is based on the need, and the need is driven by the children's need. So the more children you have, the quicker you get to the front of the queue. So the British are being shuffled backwards and backwards and backwards on this, and we are paying, essentially our government is paying for us to be colonised. But if you look at Germany, what happened in Germany over the last year, 1 million migrants, most of them male, most of them aged 18 to 30, as I keep on pointing out, military fighting age males. And apparently they will bring into the country 3 to 4 family reunification members. And I can guarantee they will not be bringing in granny and grandma. Granny and grandma, grandma and grandpa. They will not be bringing them in. They will be bringing in young people, probably wives. So in the space this year, 500,000 coming into Germany. Now that 1.5 million plus the family reunification, you're looking at maybe 5, 6, 7 million. The demographic of native Germans, aged 15 to 30, is 15 million. So in 1.5 years, you have introduced into that country 50% of the existing native demographic. And that existing native demographic, German women aged German women aged over 40, 30% of them are childless. Women aged over 40 with a degree, close on to 50% are childless. So you have a demographic that is either going down by half, and another demographic that is going to more than double, and they're at 50, no they're not, they're at 75-25 today in percentage terms. 10 years, that changes round completely in terms of the small children being born. So Germany is committing suicide as well. Sweden's doing the same thing, Britain's doing the same thing, Europe is doing the same thing. Mark Stein, who I'm sure you've all read, and if you haven't, his 2 books are something everybody should read. But Mark Stein summed up exactly the situation, and he said, the future belongs to those who can be bothered to turn up for it. Europeans are not bothering to turn up for their future, and Islam is. And for some reason, feminism never gets called out for this. Why is this? Here is the situation that we are saying, our governments are all saying, we have to import people from Pakistan and Somalia because you are not having enough children. Why can't they say this? In Russia, you get a little medal the moment you have more than 3 children. You get a little medal for something for glorious motherhood. But in Europe, we don't do this. We would rather, apparently, that our women went out to work, which essentially turns them into taxable units of production, which all socialist states love. The socialist states do not mind that we are importing the third world in order to make up for the babies that are not just not being born, but the babies that are being aborted. All here in America, I think, is it 250,000 a year? I mean, this is astonishing. So feminism never gets called out because feminism sits on that pinnacle of political correctness. At the very top is Islam. Feminism's way down below that, so you don't call it out because Islam's at the top, and Islam is the one that is benefiting in Britain, in Europe, from the fact that we no longer replace our generations. But the interesting thing here is the difference between old Eastern Europe or Central Europe, countries like Hungary and Romania and Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the rest of non-communist Europe. Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, says, listen, we don't want Muslims in our country. We're a Christian country. We don't want them here at all. Same thing with Prime Minister Zeman in the Czech Republic. The Slovak Prime Minister is saying the same thing. Every single country that used to be ruled by Russia is saying we don't want this happening in our countries. Every single country that didn't used to be ruled by Russia is saying, yeah, come on in. We're humanitarian. We believe in diversity and equality and compassion and tolerance. And the reason that we are so different to the Eastern European countries is because when they had their revolution, it was real, it was physical, it was violent. They did not need to be subverted over 60 years of indoctrination in the same way that Western Europe became. And that is why they still cling to their beliefs of being a Christian, now capitalist again, society and part of Western civilization, that Western Europe has forgotten the very foundations it was built on. And this, again, is part of the whole political correctness thing that I'm talking about. And if you cannot beat political correctness, you cannot even start trying to resist Islam. And we are finding this in England right now. We had a recent, I don't know how many people here have heard of the Pegida movement, the Patriotic Europeans Against the Islamification of Europe. And we have a new branch opened in England. And Sky News, the equivalent of your Fox News, phoned me up 2 days before the press conference for the launch, and they said, we would like to do a live interview with you the morning before the press conference. I said, that's fine. They said, can we run through a few questions with you? I said, yes, of course, that's fine. So they accuse you. They don't want to talk to you. They want to accuse you of being a bigot and a xenophobe and a Muslim hater. But they don't put it in those words. They say, don't you think that you're going to create some division within our communities in England? And I sort of point out that really I think putting bombs on trains and raping young girls is creating far more tensions than my talking about this. And so the conversation went. And then the press conference on the Monday, Sky News were going to turn up. Sky News is like, it's Rupert Murdoch. Sky News was going to turn up and do a live broadcast of that, and then afterwards some interviews with the three people leading it. On the morning going up, I got a phone call from Sky News. They said the live interview's cancelled. I said, okay, I know exactly why it's cancelled. You wanted me to say something really horrible and unpleasant about Islam, and then you could say, here is this new movement started, and here is what this horrible, hateful man has to say about it. If you say something intellectually articulate and erudite and factual and realistic, they will just put it down Orwell's memory hole. They don't want to know that. And then at the event, the live feed never happened. Nothing was beamed out at all. The interviews afterwards, nothing was mentioned by Sky News. And on the day before I went, I did a radio, a Skype interview with them for an article, a written article. The written article was pulled, so basically everything was totally airbrushed out of existence. And going back to PC again, there was way back in the 60s or 70s, a guy called Charles Reich, who was part of the whole Frankfurt School movement. And he talked about this revolution that was coming, and it will not be a revolution driven by violence. It will not be a revolution that can be resisted by violence, that it is an unstoppable revolution nonetheless. And this is part of it. They have captured the long march through the institutions. They've captured the citadels of every means of information and education in our countries. And I don't know what we can do about it. I'm hoping, this is a horrible thing to say, but I am hoping that fundamentalist Islam commits a number of atrocities across Europe over the next few years. Because if they don't do this, we are going to, as I said earlier, sleepwalk into it. And I don't really know how you combat PC. They did it over a long period of time, and they did it peacefully. We don't have 60 years to make our counter long march through the institutions. We do not have that time. Do we resort to violence in order to do it? At the moment, I will put that question out there, but I am not going to answer it myself up here. But I believe that the democratic era is changing in Europe. I believe that the next 20 years will be nothing like the last 60 years. I believe that it will end up in violence. When Yugoslavia broke up along racial, religious fault lines, I think we are going to be looking at a continental scale Yugoslavian style civil war, not fought with conventional battle lines and not fought with tanks and not fought with soldiers in uniform, but civilian against civilian, machetes, knives, small handguns. I say small handguns. We don't know in Britain whether Islam is arming, because our government knows very little about anything to do with Islam. They choose to ignore it. A few years ago we had a program called Undercover Mosques, where Channel 4, a film crew, went in and they were filming imams in there talking about throwing homosexuals off cliffs, slaughtering Jews, decapitating infidels, flying the black flag of Islam over 10 Downing Street, in more than 3 or 4 mosques. And these were just the ones that this one TV crew went into. You know, there are 3,000 mosques in Britain. I assume this sort of stuff is going on everywhere because our mosques are roughly divided between Deobandi, which is hardline Pakistan influence, and Salafist Wahhabist Saudi Arabian influence. So this is going on everywhere, but West Midlands Police chose not to prosecute a single imam talking about slaughtering Jews and Kafirs and infidels. They only prosecuted Channel 4 News for having the temerity to broadcast this stuff, showing Islam in a poor light, which obviously is not conducive to the public good and creates tensions in our communities, which is why the police now exist, apparently. They exist to stop tensions being created between our communities. Not to uphold the law anymore, but to make sure that we do not talk or say or notice anything about the situation going on. So this is why I love coming to America. I love talking to you. I love talking to you especially about guns. Everybody says, listen, it's not going to happen here. We have got God knows how many millions of guns, and it's not going to happen here. It is never going to happen in America. And one of the reasons it's not going to happen
Because we have guns.
is mostly because you have guns, but because you can look at us to see where you could be in 20 years' time. Just as we look to Sweden today to see where we'll be in 5 years' time, that you all need to look to Western Europe, to Europe generally. You all need to keep on talking out and getting into your local politicians and making sure that they push this stuff through the legislature. You get the anti-Sharia stuff in there. We're going to Tennessee in a few days' time. Tennessee is huge on this. Fantastic. And lots of other states are as well. Keep your guns. Keep talking. Keep talking out against political correctness. Because this has to be the thing that we defeat. Demolish. Not defeat, demolish, destroy, completely annihilate political correctness. And really that's it. Just thank God for America, and thank God for your First Amendment. And thank God for your Second Amendment. And thank you very much.